My name is Luna Goldberg, and I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with director Susanne Kovács of the movie It Takes a Family, which is premiering at this year's festival. Thank you all for joining us. Susanne, it's great to meet you.
Thank you for
And
having me.
of course, I want to start by thanking you for making this film, which I could only imagine must have been a challenging process. And perhaps we can start off by talking about how you came to the decision of making this film.
Yes, I think it's a personal story, as you saw. It's a film with that grew from a wish within my own family to understand better the where the emotions came from, and where my own lack of peace, or many questions that I had towards my father's generation, and also my grandparents, of course. It's of course, it's a very personal film that grew out of my own need to understand more, and that was the starting point. And then it developed, and hopefully became something that other people can mirror themselves in, or that they can also, yeah.
Yeah, and in this film, I mean, your grandmother and your father both play really central roles. And I wonder, what was their reaction when you first approached them about making the film?
Yes. I mean, I think actually what is I mean, interesting is, of course, in I mean, I would say, families of like any families of survivors, like any other family, can be so different. So in some families, you talk a lot about what happened, and it becomes very imminent that and important that the children and the grandchildren know what has happened. And there are many ways to do it. Like in any family, it can be so different what you talk about, and if it's difficult to talk about or not. And and regarding my father, he he actually, he in a way had a, what do you call that, when like it almost like it was too much to talk about, to rip open this bandage and talk about these emotions. So he was a bit like, okay, if you want to do it, please do, but I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
Which in some ways for a grandchild also can feel a bit insensitive, that how can you be exhausted? It's so important to all of us, and it's also such a burden that his mother, my grandmother, carries. So how can you be cautious, or how can you not want to open that bandage, or rip off that bandage, or to participate in that pain, or but it's also understandable, because they're, as a son and a mother, you're so close. So I think for him it was a bit difficult. Yeah. And my
Yeah.
grandmother, I mean, it's also interesting how, actually, when she said, when I asked her things, she also said, if you ask me, I'll tell you. So maybe there's also the problem sometimes that the younger generations don't ask, because, out of sensitivity, out of, how do you approach this? Is it okay to ask these sort of questions? And I think, I mean, it goes probably for every family. It doesn't have to be a family of survivors, but it's just difficult to talk about these things.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about now, I mean, it's something that I really noticed in this film. The tension between um, wanting to preserve family history, even if it's not the most pleasant stories, right? But also not wanting to cause harm to our loved ones by opening the door to memories that they want to leave behind. And so it's interesting to hear you in talking about your grandma, that willingness after so long, uh, having kept that secret or not necessarily been so open about it.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, yes. I mean, it's it was a bit of a stop and go process between us, between my grandmother and I as well, because I show very honestly in the film that she also has some reluctance and some, there's some things that are resurfacing, and it's not easy all of the time. And there are times when she says, like, she at some point in the film she says, it's not your life, it's not your story, it's my story, Susanne. And I think that's a very good point, because there's, I think this, what the film also sort of opens up as a discussion within families is like, what, you know how much is it my story, how much is it your story? Of course it's her story, and of course she can say stop, and she can say, no, I don't want this. And that's important to show that in film, the difficulties and the process that we had gone or go through together, as you see it unfold, right? And I think so there were points where she said stop, and then but then we overcame that, and in the end I think there were more things gained than lost in that process, and so did she. So sorry, what was the question now? I forgot the question. But I mean, it's yeah, I lost my thread, sorry.
No, I think, yeah, exactly. It was a process, and also working through that process together over time.
Yeah. And also this, if, like, um I don't know how it is for other families, but in mine, I mean, at least this, if something so enormously defining has happened to one generation, it spills over into the next generation, and it does it has affected my father's life, and in a more, in a lesser way, but still it has affected my life too. And it defined our relationship, because there were other things like that my parents met, and they're very different backgrounds and so forth. So the history sort of defined the relationship I had with my grandmother to start with. And so it also is like, you could say it's also my destiny and my story. But it's I think, what I also wanted to show or to talk about is these things, how are we, I mean, we are connected as family, and it's a blessing, but it can also be difficult for all generations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, in the film, we see these different layers of trauma that surface across generations. And specifically, there was one line that stopped me. I think it was something that you said in the film, in talking about your own experience and talking about your father and your grandmother. And the line was, it was almost as if we were competing for who was treated the worst. And I found that to be a really interesting dynamic, the way you framed it, and also through your film as these narratives come out.
Yeah. I'm so curious, what was it with, I mean, now, can I ask you a question? What was it with you that sort of, that you reacted to in that dynamic?
Well, I think it is these different roles that we play, right? When we think of the Holocaust, there's always this narrative of perpetrator and victims, and um, even in some of the narratives that come out in the story around your own and your father's interactions with your grandmother, the way that power plays out, the way that through trauma, um, some dynamics shift. I think that's what was interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean it. I think it's also but in the family. It's. I mean, okay. I don't know. I mean, as a grandchild, of course, whatever I have to deal with, or whatever the life throws at me, it still feels so minor compared to what my grandmother has endured and what that generation has endured. And it's not a competition. It's like it's or if it was, she would always have, double down, because it's just awful what happened to them. And I think I don't want to say with the film, oh, I had a equally hard time. So I hope nobody would ever think that. It's really about, first of all, uh, remembering what she went through, and also giving voice to that, and in a very individual story. This is only one family, so, but I can't speak for other families. But I think what happened to her and what she overcame is, of course, it affects me, and that's sort of the starting point. So it's out of love that I have these questions. I hope you see that in the film. But having said that, it also spilled over to my father, and it affected him, and it also affected how he parented, and how my life evolved, or how our relationship evolved. So, and the dynamic that, if I mean, her pain, of course, is so big, but what I came to with the sentence was sort of that my father also had a lot of pain, and I also speak to that, and you see that he, that maybe what happened to my grandparents also influenced how they parented, as you can see. And there are some questions there, and he has a lot of anger towards his mother. So the competition is sort of that everybody's in their own pains, and then you can't help each other or see each other's pain, or sort of become, you're in a fog of your own pain. That's sort of why I felt there is this competition when everybody's in their own pain. And I, of course, had to also reflect on and be critical for myself. Why am I so? Because I'm also very angry at my father, and along the way, I'm not that angry anymore, but I show in the film that I have frustrations, and I wanted to also show my own lack of understanding and my own, pain, and yeah.
Yeah, and I also see, I mean, this is something that only was touched upon a little bit in the film, but thinking about your mother, right? Your mother, who is German, and this passage when they announced to your grandmother that she's pregnant, and you see this loss of German identity from her side. So again, you see this matriarchal impact that trickles down across these generations.
Yes, it's like a microcosmos in a way, because I mean, it must have been difficult for my grandparents, of course, to have it so close, and have a grandchild. Yeah. Yes. I think it always stood in the way between my grandmother and I. So I felt, that she always kept me at a certain distance, but at the same time was very warm. So it was a bit of a, I don't know what you call that in English, but a complicated love. So, and maybe it became a little less complicated and maybe that's also why she was so willing to talked to me because she had a very special, we had this special relationship. It was, the foundation was difficult, and yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess, I mean, again, we see this trauma that manifests in the film and is passed down through generations. Even when survivors choose to be silent or to forget the past and move forward. I guess one of my questions for you is a little bit more conceptual. How do we break this cycle?
Of silence, or
Of silence, of passing these experiences down. You know, I think of this because when you end the film with the clip of you and your child, and
yeah,
it's this new generation, and
and the
I
wish not to pass that on to the next generation, of course. So that's a huge motivation as well, of course, when you become a parent, that you look at these things and you don't yeah, it's very touching in a way. Well, I think, as much as, as much as there are difficulties and what you could call, or what actually you would call trauma, right, in my family, that is passed on from generation to generation. It's I guess there's also I call the film It Takes a Family, because it takes it's sort of the family that inflicts all these problems on you, but it's also the family that gives you the chance to work them through, in a way. It's like a gift, it's a blessing, and sometimes it can be the other thing as well. But I guess we can agree on that family also has a lot of it's love and the the power and the things that carry you, and there's also, because I think they're also, what I also discovered when you talk about, when you're actually really willing to listen to somebody, when you actually say, hey, I really want to hear how you feel, because I think it's not so much about what you think, it's more about what she felt and how she was. How are you? And you care to hear the answer, even if it's surprising, or something happens. So I think there is, of course, I come from a generation that we think we can talk about everything, and there are limitations to that. I also learned that talking to my grandmother, because there are maybe things you can't talk through that are just as they are with trauma, and so it's not like you can talk about everything. But I still believe, or I experienced in our family, that it's good to ask these questions, and it's good to talk. And I think that's in a way has opened and healed some things also, at least for my father as well, and for sure also between my grandmother and I. And how do you break that cycle? I have two children, and my oldest child, he when making this film, it's a long process. So when he would tell people when he was younger, he told, yeah, my mother is making a film about trauma, and when you talk about it, then it doesn't repeat itself. So that's, in the simplest way, is sort of the core of a motivation. Why do you work through these things, and why do you have to chew it through, and why do you have to, myself, why do I have to spend years and time making this film? I do believe that it healed, and it healed something within my family. And yeah.
Wow.
I don't know if it's an answer enough, but
No,
I think it's individual.
It's a big question.
But I do think, and I think because I also talk to others who are more professionally work with Holocaust survivors. And again, I'm just speaking for, I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but there is also the element of just acknowledging what happened and to carry that with the first generation and to do that together. I think that has a healing power as well.
Absolutely.
And it has, and also that it really happened, that you validate that it really happened, and that's important.
Yeah, it definitely takes a lot of courage to dig into these family histories, especially when they are sometimes painful memories. I guess one of my last questions for you is, what were you expecting to find in making this film? And what were some of the unexpected discoveries or lessons that came from it?
Yeah. I guess when I started out, I was very eager to ask questions and of course, a search in what happened, but also sometimes I would be very clumsy in my questions, also to ask more factual things, even though I wanted to know more about the emotions and how we feel with each other and get to that conversation. And sometimes you go around it by approaching it in clumsy ways. And but really, I think, with my grandmother, the dynamic was that when I stopped asking questions and when I stopped being so, I want to know something, then, and like sort of let go, then she actually opened up. And so it's interesting how that can change. It's like if I didn't want, or push. But I think she knew that my interest was genuine and I really wanted to share and understand at that point. Yeah. And then there's also the thing that, there are things that you just can't really fix in a lifetime, maybe, or there are maybe some things that are just, as they are, and we can change the way we feel about them, but they're just there,
Wow.
But yeah, I actually have a question for you. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So I think it's very exciting to be at Miami Jewish Film Festival, also, to show it in a context of a Jewish film festival, and how, as we're more or less in the same generation, maybe I'm a bit older, but how is it relevant for you to see? Is there other things that you can sort of relate to, or?
I have to say that I work in the Jewish world. I'm the education manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. And so a lot of my work deals with Jewish culture, Jewish arts, Not too much with the Holocaust, but it is something that that we do work on. And there are so many films that approach the Holocaust in different ways. But right now, we're living in this moment where there are very few survivors. And the ways in which we're able to hear these stories is becoming much more limited. I work oftentimes with students at the university and young students as well. And I think it's so important to have different stories for them to relate to. And for that reason, specifically, I think it's lovely to have films like this one, where you're watching this narrative unfold through really the work that you're doing as a family. Because, again, like you show in the film, it is something that affects generations over time. And there was another line in your film that struck me. It was something also that you said about how this is a story about how we tell the past, what we emphasize. And I think specifically in relation to the Holocaust, where there are so many different narratives, we have a responsibility to tell these stories from different standpoints to really be able to pass it on to generations.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because, yeah, I'm really glad to hear that.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm happy to have the film here, and always open to discussions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Susanne, from the movie It Takes a Family, for joining us.